life conditions in the spiral dynamics sense, this was done, this image was done 10 years ago. And that was really the way the spiral dynamics community viewed world's life conditions. The world is tearing itself apart, and spiral wizards need to be there solving the problems, stitching together the world. And definitely an entirely different view than Wilbur brings to this. All right. So Graves called his original theory emergent cyclical levels of existence. And those levels created different forms of mind is the term the Keegan folks use. And it basically means your capacity meets our life conditions, and it produces both your form of mind and our shared intersubjective form of mind. So this is from Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's done a much better job of making Keegan's work accessible. And so she talks about a change in meaning making and moving parts of your world from subject to object. So we're newly able to step back. We can reflect on something, make decisions about it from a broader perspective. But it's basically the change in the form of meaning making. It's changing the way we know, not what you know. And it's moving more and more of what's unseen, unexamined, to what can, as an individual or as a group, we can see and imagine. So, and she says, coping with complexity is not a skill you can acquire. It's a way of seeing and living in the world. And Graves would go further beyond that and say that in order to advance adult development from one meme to the next, it requires a change in your neurological structure. And those of us who look at the neurology of child development see, for example, from adolescent to what we call civilized adult, there is actually a marked change in neurological structure. The frontal cortex just becomes better able to control the more primitive parts of our brain. So that's what Graves was talking about when he said capacity needed to evolve internally before we could change our way of coping with our life conditions. And the blank slate folks now talk about constructed reality because the research shows that that there's no such thing as a blank slate where only what our environment tells us is what gets absorbed. But constructed reality in the form of this picture, right? This is just a perfect metaphor of what they talk about when they say you need to move back and begin to look at your situation from a broader viewpoint. So when Graves first started this work, he talked about waves of development. So he never talked about steps. But he also talked about these interference patterns between waves. And one of the things that happens there is a lot of chaos, right? And we talk about both moving on, but also transcending and including, right? And sometimes this chaos becomes so awful that instead of including, people compartmentalize and reject. So you see that, for example, when people move away from very strict religious, almost culty religious situations, right? They just push away a lot of the blue rules and the blue thinking to the point where they, unlike healthy orange, they don't see the value of rules of civilization anymore. So you can get those sorts of problems. But you'll also notice Graves was just absolutely adamant that that previous capacity was retained and that we should use it when appropriate. You know, if the terrorists attacked the schoolroom, green is not the appropriate response. And so in sometimes we have to cope with the environment we're in, not the environment that we've evolved to. And so this is something that comes from one of his original illustrations. You'll notice he uses letters, and those letters are the environment and the internal capacity of your own brain to deal with that environment. So you notice A, N, B, C. And as he was doing his research, he found people at a 7th stage that he noticed as he worked his way through these stages and evaluating them, and the reason he put them in this order was partly because he did longitudinal studies, and people moved from here to here as students and from here to here as students. You know, this was a very common move as college students developed. But also because one of the things he noticed is each of these groups, as they moved on, had more capacity to deal with the issues around them. They just seemed to be better at solving problems. It's that, you know, we all see it, right? Somebody's banging their head against the brick wall, and somebody else says, you know, why are you doing that? You could just walk over to the door, right? And we can't see that internally ourselves yet. And as we move up Graves' stages, what he found is that people suddenly saw that door without even having it pointed out to them. And then as he came to what he called the momentous leap, he actually thought it was going back to almost an existential need to cope with survival. And, you know, Graves in the Cold War and in Vietnam was very conscious of how tumultuous the world was and how the problems were increasing. You know, this is 50 years ago, right? That he's conscious of how bad things are getting from the viewpoint of his generation. And he thought maybe we were back to another beige type of survival. And so this is his double helix model. So this is directly what he was talking about when he talked about life conditions and our internal cognitive ability to deal with them. This is what it looks like. Oh, I should have said, I just pasted into the chat a link to the Facebook page where we've got the PDF that has these if you want to open them on your own. Sorry about that. Should have remembered. So this is what the double helix looks like. And so when Graves talks about life conditions, he doesn't mean just the whole global life conditions. He means our daily life conditions, our local society that we're embedded in, and then on to the larger and larger life conditions. And one of the things that's becoming real clear nowadays is that at various levels, those life conditions are grossly incompatible with each other, right? If you think about that as being a problem. But I also, before we talk about this, I want to talk about the difference between a value meme or a stage and the small m meme content that goes into it. Its structure, it's not at all about content. So you can get exactly the same content from a bunch of different vMemes. And it's about how you think. It's not what you're thinking about. And these small m memes are contagious as the flu, yes, but they also only stick if they make sense in terms of your current stage, right? So some memes just can't stick because you can't process that at the stage. Difference in Christian churches, right? The Catholic Church originally incorporated a bunch of the purple pagan rituals, winter solstice, Christmas trees, right, in order to help people transition into the more blue. And, you know, and you look at Calvinist, Baptist, now pure blue fundamentalists. I don't know if you all are familiar with mega churches now. Lakewood in Houston bought the local basketball arena and has this mega, yep, I'm not kidding, it is humongous. And they're prosperity religions. So we're all going to be orange together, and we will help each other be prosperous in God's name. Unity, if you're not familiar with that, it's a very positive green church, and they use spiral dynamics. So we're talking about all these interactions, but we're also living in a world where this is sort of the spiral dynamics view of life conditions over time, right? Going from simpler to more complex. Unfortunately, human brains are doing good if they've reached this level, right? The brains evolved down here. They didn't evolve to be up here. And so it's a serious disconnect between what the average human is comfortable with and what's happening in the world around them. This is another interesting diagram. So one of the problems with overpopulation is that the average age of the population is very young, right? And I'll have to say, Wilbur is just wrong. You can't make a 15-year-old second tier. I don't care what spiritual states you run them through. The neurons don't develop from a single state experience. And so the problem becomes then that, you know, all this bit about pushing democracy down into the third world becomes a problem, because democracy needs something that looks more like that as far as a population in order to work. This is empire, right? So we end up with these sorts of disconnects that we don't pay enough attention to. I personally disagree with folks who say that, oh, you know, we've got 5% of yellow now, or in any environment. Beck dealt with only people that wanted to work with him, right? So of course he saw folks that were more evolved. Bill Joyner the same way. It's a self-selection issue, right? Jennifer Garvey Berger works with mainstream corporate folks in the US. And she says they're more blue than orange. They just sound orange because the blue gospel that they've been taught is capitalism, right? Yeah. So this is what she thinks is the leading edge, and I think she's much closer to correct as far as the West, and something more like that for the world. So we've got just a totally confused and polarized world, but more so in Europe now with mass migrations, and always in the United States, we don't have anything like a homogeneous set of conditions. We're so polarized, so marginalized in some folks. Some of the latest studies have shown that Democrats now move into communities of Democrats, and Republicans now move into cities with parts of the city with more Republicans. That wasn't true 50 years ago, but it is now. So not only are we separating vMemedically, but we're doing it physically as well, which becomes more and more of a problem with life conditions. And I think in terms of spiral dynamics, folks, you know, most folks would look at the world, and this is our situation now, right? Both with overpopulation and with not capitalism, because whatever's going on out there, if you ask the escapees from the Wall Street gang, they'll all say the same thing. Whatever the heck these guys are doing, there's no relationship to capitalism, but we're suddenly on a downward trend physically, right? Just in the physical world. So I'm going to stop now and we're going to go to discussion, right? So how can we recognize our life conditions? Do our current stages impact how we recognize life conditions? How could we help each stage have a better chance at understanding a really complex world? So do we want to do it at first in smaller groups, or do we think we're small enough to do the whole thing as a single group? Anybody have a strong preference one way or the other?
No strong preference. I think there's benefits and disadvantages to both.
Yeah, we're just at that size where it's almost too big to do a group, right?
If we do, we could split it right in half, and then people can have more say, and then we can come back to the group. Whatever you
All
want.
right, that sounds like a plan. All right, so I'm just going to throw you into two groups. How about 15 minutes of discussion, and then we'll come back as a single group?
Can you put the questions into the chat so we can still look at that?
Could I do that? And also, if you haven't seen the chat, there's a link to the slides as well, if you want to look at those. Could I put the questions into the chat? I probably could do something like that. No, I can't. Okay, let me see if I can. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the recorder until we get back from the.
Great, thanks, Barbara.
There you go.
I think help each stage have a better chance. Cool.
So I know in our group we didn't choose a spokesperson. How about the other group? Do you have somebody who's ready to debrief?
I will nominate Eric.
I will accept your nomination. Thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
So we were just checking in with one another, I think, on life conditions and how we interpret the spiral in terms of, and we were kind of talking a little bit about this, Barbara, earlier, that I think there are two perspectives that come out of the spiral. One's more interior and the other is exterior. And like both of them have, I think, a there. So how can these things almost reconcile? Because when we say life conditions, it can be very easy to say that somebody's at a certain stage, but it would be something else to say that we're experiencing perhaps multiple points of these stages every day. But Josh kind of wrapped it up at the end to say that, well, maybe there's something to the center of gravity within any given stage, and what exactly is that? So yeah, and Marjorie, I'd like if you feel like jumping in, just to touch base on some of the ways that you were orienting yourself towards the spiral, because I thought it was insightful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, just briefly, I think that as far as conditions, they are not static at all. They can change on a dime at any given moment. You know, the conditions, we only have partial control, if at all, over the conditions. And then the other thing was that in terms of both the spiral dynamics and Wilbur's work, I don't think that the intention was to say that you could put any particular person within a grouping like that. It would not be helpful that we all have the potential and capacity for all of these levels within us all the time, and we have access to those, at least in potential. and that that everyone starts out at square one. I think I didn't say that part, but basically also in terms of a state of consciousness, one of the multiple intelligences that I'd like to reference for myself is the spiritual intelligence, which is defined as being able to respond or behave in such a way that you are responding with peace and calm, regardless of the conditions, regardless of the situation. And that's something that has to be developed, but we all have the capacity for that. I don't know if there was anything else there, but I think that was pretty much it for me. Thanks.
A question, Marjorie. Do you think that spiritual calm center is available at most stages?
At most stages, you mean the most levels of development?
Right. In other words, is there a red calm center? Is there a blue calm center, or is it something that only comes at higher stages? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. I don't know have a specific answer, but I feel basically that spiritual intelligence is something that we're all born with the capacity for all of these intelligences, and that they can be developed and encouraged at any level. So yeah, I basically would say yes. I think that the potential for it is there.
And certainly we would see that in tales of saints and Buddhas and all of that throughout history, right? Where certainly the society was not beyond red, blue, and yet individuals were able to hold that calm center for themselves and often for folks around them.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other thoughts from that group?
The only Josh, I didn't know if you were going to hop in. You're good. The only other thing that and Andre, I see your camera went on. So before I say anything, did you want to say something?
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to point to my point that actually everybody sees the same life conditions depending on their worldview. Like if a person is red, she sees the world as red. His neighbor or maybe his wife living near him and being blue sees the same living conditions as blue. You can take a war in Ukraine. So there are like many people involved. Some of them live now on purple, or beige, they survive. They care about their family, that's it, they don't care about anything else, they have to survive. Others take weapons and they fight. So they see world as red. So we have to kill them, more of them, and we have to survive. This is red. From blue point of view, it will be like breach of order. The order has to be restored. So the law and peace has to be restored. If you orange, you see the same war as competition of two big powers. So it's like, and which one is better, the one will prevail. Like from green point of view, it's a great disaster and so on. What's interesting, like any of us can choose different perspectives. Like we may choose, okay, let's see the war as red. So we choose the party and our party has to win. Or we can say we look at the world as blue. So we want that the rules are applied and then we have the order. If you try to like not to pick any of those perspectives as your own, but to look from multiple perspectives and like to see that, well, there are many different people and you can also choose multiple perspectives, then this would be already kind of yellow point of view on the world.
Yeah, and one thing that I've been very mindful of as I have read through spiral dynamics and just thought about how would I associate it with a person or a group, and then how firmly can I make the assertion that they're at that stage and that that's their primary mode of operation. And I started to realize that it felt like stereotyping. And it's very, very nuanced, but within each of these, yeah, thank you, Barbara, for bringing that up. So within each of these stages, the stereotyping component is that, say I can identify a group that, like, okay, they seem like a green oriented, green minded group of people. They share in green language, green focuses, and so on. Like, okay, I can see how their reasoning indicates their logic, where, like, okay, that to me is an indication that they have logic and that they can also think of it within this way that cross contextualizes it. So essentially green. The thing about stereotyping, though, is that within those groups, it's not, I don't think it's a one-to-one that everybody is strongly at green. You might have somebody in their group that's very much at blue, but they're a part of that ethos. So how then would those interior and exterior perspectives play on one another? So if this is the interior going up and down stage from an individual's viewpoint, and then here's how somebody on the outside with the third person perspective can interpret their group, how then are those pulling on one another to adjust the group or the person? So like Andre was saying, if something is outside of somebody's control and they're in a war-torn area, but the individuals in that group and the group itself are very much at green, the conditions would pull downward, and that's where people would then start to be pulled down into that as well, because the environment associates for that. But people can also think of a vision that can rebuild the environment to come up as well. So if this makes sense at all, I've been kind of looking at how these things play on one another, where they kind of both need one another, because you need the visionaries, you need the people who are in, maybe even a blue, that just have these peak experiences in second tier to really get the group to be influenced and to move up. So maybe at some point we could just talk about the language that Clare Graves and others have used to define the transformation between stages and what exactly is happening in that space.
And we want to do a program on that in the future. So stay tuned, because that's an excellent point. So this is some of the work on that. So notice the nature of experience differences, and I think it's just bang on to say that somehow the universe that you inhabit as someone at blue is materially different than the universe that someone at green sees around them. And the values, what it is that we're looking for in that external universe: safety, power, salvation, material comforts, community, all of those. So I guess what I'm hearing everybody say agrees with this initial research, saying that we see our environments as we are internally, not as they are, but as we are. But then I also wonder what happens when we move in a world in which all of these value memes are active, often in people next door, right? Or less so in people next door, because for sure these two memes are separating out and actually moving either into a blue environment or a more green environment. They're moving into separate physical environments these days. And meanwhile, we've always had the problem in the West with the marginalized folks being stuck in marginalized communities without access to the daily life that the rest of us share in. So let's move on to the second group. Bill?
Bill had to step out. He had put that in the chat.
I missed it because I was looking at the share. David, would you like to kind of debrief for group 2? I'll just put you on the spot.
Boy, I don't know if I can. Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, I don't know if I can either. We went several different places, right? But I think I'll let you and Sophia just talk about where you guys took us then, real quick.
Go ahead, Sophia.
Where did I take us? So I trained in traditional Chinese medicine from 1999 to 2002. And in that time, I asked my teacher, who was a physics teacher, actually, he was a qualified physics teacher, but he was training in the European Shiatsu school. I said, if these principles that you're telling us about apply to the living system of one individual body, so we were learning to work with the energy system of a person through the physical body. These principles apply to a single living organism that is a person, then these same principles apply to the whole of an organization or the whole of a school. And only you could ask a question like that, Sophia. And that was the first time that I realized in that first 10-week foundation that I was actually learning a new language that my imagination could play with. And it's the first time that I had felt like that in my life. I was about 37 years old. And I hadn't realized really until that point how I thought. And this was after training, after reading Carlos Castaneda's books at 19 years old. So I was, in a way, conversant with the fact that there's a world of energy that is the real world of nature that we live in. And then there's society. And quite quickly in my practice, what I talk about, especially nowadays, is that there's a machine, Sophia, and all of the things that she learned. Some of that's good. I learned how to drive a car. I learned how to speak 4 languages. I've learned how to use the underground in London that I've just moved to 3 days ago. And so I can do different things. They're all my machine programs. And there's also a lot of things that I wish wasn't on those programs because they were the conditioning. And then there's organic Sophia. And she's the person who has a completely blank page, there's no programs there, and she responds and moves in flow. So that's how I make a distinction between myself and when I'm working with other people. And since 2002, when I qualified with, I'm going to call it a turquoise perspective of good health. I'm working with traditional Chinese medicine and lots of other things that I do now, but the same kind of principles. I regularly travel up and down the spiral, learning about myself, getting triggered. And, what was that about then? Or meeting other people who, oh, where are they? And why is that going on with them? The blue, stuck in a bit of blue. Or, when I talk about the shadow side of blue and the light side and the healthy side of red. So making friends with my own red has probably been the most challenging thing, in a way that I had to not be afraid of it, and the reds, the shadow reds that I call them, from other people. So, and I come from
so that's the whole goal of second tier, right? To be able to work with all of the first stages, with all 6 of them in a productive way, both inside ourselves, and we all have a hole in our soul, right? We all have at least one, or if we're really unfortunate, more than one vMeme that isn't as accessible for us for various reasons, right?
Yes.
For a lot of women, it's healthy red, right? And for a lot of baby boomers, it was healthy blue. So so you know, part of this internal thing is recovering the value of those memes and working with people in those memes, recognizing both the healthy and the unhealthy. Because if I don't have a healthy blue, I'm sure not going to be able to tell the difference between healthy and unhealthy rules. Eric, you had a thought.
Barbara, I was hoping, can you expand a little bit? I think I know what you're talking about, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it. When you say baby boomers were like heading towards a blue.
Towards a blue? No, away from a blue.
Away from blue. Okay,
Right.
so yeah, can you
in
expand
a
on that a little bit?
rejection. Yeah, you're not old enough to have experienced this, right? So so World War II brought out blue in people, and it brought out the we sort of blue in America, right? But the prosperity after the war brought out orange, and one of the things the GI Bill did was really brought farm boys and working class boys, and not all of them white, into the prosperity fold, allowed them to participate in orange. And yet the underlying worldview of the parents' generation of baby boomers was blue, and partly that was, I think, experiential. The war had caused part of that. The Depression had caused part of that, and so and then as the Vietnam War popped up, there was just total rejection of that worldview, right? Even among some of my parents' generation, I think. Killing babies in Vietnam seemed to have nothing to do with saving the world for democracy, right? And so an awful lot of baby boomers just pushed blue away as these old rules don't mean anything. These old traditions are harmful. And I mean, you saw it in some of the free love movements and the sort of bizarre reversal of sexual norms, right? So instead of being unhealthily repressed, we were unhealthily unrepressed, right? And totally divorced sex from any kind of interpersonal, for example. So all of that left an awful lot of baby boomers, particularly of the educated or more affluent class, with a big hole in blue. They just moved on to orange and then played around in green. But still, one of the reasons I think we're getting now a lot of toxic reaction to some of the stuff that not so healthy green is doing is because we also had baby boomers who were never into this elite class who still kept their blue, right? And they're not very happy with what they're seeing. So it's there's baby boomers are really bifurcated, into the sort of more affluent educated class and the working class. But the folks we hang around tend to be in the former, and sometimes they're just not very nice folks as far as the rules that they think ought to be out there. Which kind of brings me to anything else you wanted to add, Dave?
Yeah. I mean, your last comments just really got me thinking, and observation that I've had for a while is just like how the whole evolutionary societal process plays out, and especially through the 20th century, and the Vietnam War was just kind of like one chapter in that process. And it seems like ultimately orange ends up destroying blue eventually. And through the world wars in the 20th century, it's like the blue nationalism is mixed in with orange technology. And ultimately, you know, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, after one after another. And now we see, like with the Iraq war, all of a sudden, you know, now the draft is no longer acceptable, and you have this smaller pool of blue that's fighting the wars. And now it's like with Ukraine, it's like it's totally outsourced now. There's not enough blue America to fight the war, so we're outsourcing the blue and letting the Ukrainians be the entire sacrificial blue in this conflict. And so as the blue shrinks, like the orange technology, just like you get the most nationalist, the most loyal, the most sacrificial people, and they're eliminated from society through these subsequent wars. And the blue just eventually disappears, and you're left with orange and green who don't really want to fight war because it's more individualistic and more about the now, right? Because orange is express self now for what, or express self, what, how's that go? Express self for,
Express self,
express self now for reward now.
no, it's express self now, without getting yourself into trouble with the people around you, is
I was trying to use the Gravians.
is that, yeah, and I forget the
now
exact
for
wording,
reward
but
now, and green is sacrifice now for acceptance now. But it's the key thing is orange and green both align with now,
yeah,
whereas blue is sacrifice now for reward later. So blue is willing to give itself in the moment, whereas
right.
orange and green are not.
And I think another thing we talked before we started recording about the problems with police brutality, in that you know, it's an official place where red bullies are allowed to roam the streets, and likewise where we now have an all-volunteer army. The army is a place where red bullies who haven't yet developed any blue limits at all are welcomed. And so we have, you know, the Russian volunteer brigades, the mercenary volunteer brigades in Ukraine, right? All of which are not necessarily bringing in healthy blue who are going to, you know, defend democracy and defend our people. They're also bringing in a bunch of red bullies who just like war zones.
I think, yeah, that becomes the problem, right? Because you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And if there's not
Right.
enough blue around, all the blue's been eliminated, or people have fled it to survive, that's what you're left with.
Yep. So, you know, going from that, I want to go on to the second question that I wanted to bring to the group. And let me share my screen. Can everybody see that? So this is just some of the people who work in adult development theory, right? And one of the things we might notice about these are they're all Westerners, right? And so, you know, the second question that we put out in the write-up was, is this just an egotistical Western view of how the riffraff should have been developing and haven't? So looking at the words that we put into here, tribal, right? And then it's described as the childhood mind. Adolescent, empires, right? But then we come to the real Western, traditional, right? modern, postmodern. So if the Europeans hadn't colonized the rest of the known universe, the question becomes, would development have looked like that? You know, once we hit modern, this view of what older societies looked like popped into existence, right? Then after World War II, once we hit postmodern, which is not a very healthy stage of green, again, this view of what world development looked like popped into existence. So the question comes up, is this a Western viewpoint? If the Chinese or the Japanese had been allowed to develop without Western influence, would theirs have looked like this? Japan says yes. You know, as soon as the Great White Fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay and told them submit or else, they immediately went here. They started to study the Western development to be better than we were. Now they got but with a traditional foot so heavy of Japanese tradition that they ended up going to war about it. But they very much went into we're going to study our enemy. We're going to look at that. So I see David had a thought on this.
Yeah, I like your questions, and I think it's kind of both at the same time, right? I think whatever is going on there is a developmental track. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, Graves was a, you know, Western scientist in the peak of the age of discovery of the 20th century. And this was a Western model for understanding what was going on. And I think we have to maybe have that kind of distance or separation with it. And like, if you look through the Western history, one of the things that's kind of unique to the Western thought is the whole dualistic perspective, you know, mind and body being separated, and kind of like this bifurcation theme. So in a lot of ways, I think the Western mindset was kind of already set up to be with high affinity for the orange vMeme, you know, the Cartesian complexity dual variable XY graph, you know, all of that just fits perfectly with that dualistic perspective.
Or we could say that's where Western evolution had led us, right? And then it was just the natural. A thought on that, Harari says he thinks that the biggest aha of the Enlightenment was that we could be wrong. You know, blue is so, we have to be right. And so let's always keep that in mind of orange as well, that it's not about, it's about a search for truth, but it's not about being right in its healthy form.
Yeah, totally. Because, yeah, I mean, like, there's so many different directions I could go here, but because you were pointing out earlier how, like, in the early church in Europe, you know, there was still a lot of purple and red in there, and a lot of what the Reformation was like simultaneously trying to clean up the purple and red and hold the church accountable to its blue ideals. But in doing so, simultaneously at the same time, kind of open that door to orange ideas and Protestantism and priesthood of all believers. I mean, priesthood of all believers aligns so closely with like one person, one vote kind of idea. And so like that all was happening at the same time. It's like, we're going to raise the standards for blue. And in doing so, people were ready for starting to explore orange. And I think that's important for any developmental transition. And I think it'll be interesting, I think, you know, in the sense that the West duality made it almost kind of optimal for orange, I think it's also going to make it really hard for the West to like let go of orange. And why I think a lot of the green is like so unhealthy is because it's like, well, we're still trying to do green like orange, you know, it's not working.
But you know, that's a wrong terminology. Graves would have said not let go of orange. Never let go of orange, never let go of blue, right? Because they have a valid reason for existing in our psyches.
Yeah,
So,
sure, I'll accept that. By let go, I guess mean, what would be a better word?
transcend. Transcend is
De-emphasize. Maybe.
Yeah, transcend and include only the healthy forms. Because one of the things that Graves did say is that when systems die for lack of ability to cope with their life conditions, that they double down and triple down on doing the same old thing over and over again, you know, just the typical description of insanity, right? Expecting different results. But it seems like, especially in groups, individuals sometimes, yes, sometimes no, but in groups, it seems to be just the norm that a group just doubles down and then triples down on its counterproductive behavior over and over, rather than accepting what life conditions are telling you, which is, honey, you just need to do something else with your life, right?
And I think sometimes that happens at the end, the final stage, right? There's this kind
Yes.
of hubris of like, no, it's going to be like this. And
Right.
And that's when things like really start to break.
Yes.
So, go ahead, Barbara.
You had a thought, right?
I did.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, to contextualize what I'm saying, so the question is saying, are we looking at cultural development through Western lenses? In one of my doctoral classes, I had a Latina who is very radicalized, very impassioned on far left identities and let's just say endeavors. And, you know, I wanted to listen to her, give her, you know, due diligence, you know, whatever she's impassioned about, I want to hear where she's from. So we had like a seminar style, and, you know, I understand that she wants to focus on indigenous language and what she feels has been lost and what she's trying to recover. So very impassioned for that. And I started to share integral theory and how spiral dynamics was something that really allowed me to see bits about myself, bits about society that I think kind of holds. I do see these things. And it was the first time I have ever heard anybody criticize integral theory as just another white supremacist movement. And I paused because I'm like, whoa, how is that even possible? Like, this is one of the like most diverse theories I think I've ever seen. So in the process of that, and, you know, this was years ago at this point, I've just been stuck on that, just really walking through, like going back and reading Don Beck's interpretations, Saeed Dalavani's book on memenomics, same thing, you know, what sort of language is being used and how are things taking shape. And I'm like, well, everybody still kind of has something there. Like, it's just, it's the logic, for lack of a better word, that we construct day to day that kind of defines which stage you're at. If it's just how you, like Andre was saying, if it's just how your worldview is shaped, that's just how it's shaped. So I started to think about how this model of the spiral, if I set that aside and say like, okay, that's just another white person's idea, that's just a white, you know, that's just more white people saying that they're way further ahead than everybody else, and this is the model that they're going to use to justify how they got to where they're at. And that's when I started to think like, okay, well then what is it that we're calling Western? So in Europe, and I looked this up a while ago, I just had a random thought where of all the regions around the world, Africa, the Far East, South America, Europe, which region has seen more bloodshed due to war? And in the Euro-Asian peninsula, or not peninsula, sorry, the continent, that list was longer than I found in any other region. And it just really got me thinking, like, okay, so there's a social dynamic fought through wars where people had to reason with one another and try to build alliances and do all these sort of military tactics that elevated, just that normal red tribal warfare into, well, how do we use blue to motivate people because we're at war? The Holy Roman Catholic Church to me was an example of that, where you had a huge interpretation of blue that was really justifying red. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, the Western world pushed towards that because it just kept kind of getting bigger and bigger alliances, bigger wars, and then it just erupts all the way into like a world war. And then I started thinking about, like, okay, well, there are Pacific Islanders who haven't really seen much of any of that. And would they show signs of anything within the stage theory that might, I'm sorry, is there something that a Pacific Islander would look at the model of integral theory and say, that's just a product of all those wars being fought that allowed for these stages to unfold because populations kept getting bigger and bigger. But if you keep it small, then yeah, those are just models of whatever that cultural experience is by those people, but that doesn't play into something that can be very distinct and unique, but we wouldn't have any way of seeing that if we're only interpreting it through whatever Western lens and the products that came out of that came to that island. So that to me is where, if there's a huge cultural distinction and worldview and experience and so on, and Sophia, I think you were talking about this earlier, where every day you're just kind of going through, it's almost like you're checking in with different stages. And that can open up like a whole other way of even thinking about how the integral model would play into a need to even label anything. So that's when I think, like, if anything with the stages, the super high ones, and like I admit I'm not there yet, like I'm checking in with it now, but I don't feel like every day I wake up and that's what I'm focused on. I feel like I'm trying to focus on what else is going at the world at these other stages. So that kind of brings me into that space. But the interpretation of the spiral through a Western lens, I don't see how you can separate the two. So, what brought Clare Graves to New York? Where was his heritage originally from, and how did that shape how he was asking the questions, and who exactly was the population or the sample size that he was studying to look at their reasoning modes and how they justify this, and what was the cultural and environmental context that they were justifying their reasoning. And that's where
that's a really interesting question. So in the Midwest US, which is sort of Clare Graves probably comes more from this sort of a background of the baby boomer era. It was multi-mimetic. And so people thought that their duty was to raise kids up through the vMemes. I mean, you cared for your little purple child, right? And communities did purple things. I mean, they used to harvest together because nobody could afford their own in those days $10,000 harvesting machine. So the community had one, and we all did the harvest together. Very purple, right? The adolescence was encouraged in things like football and sports and stuff, but it was also beaten down pretty heavily by the old ladies at church. You need to learn to behave like a civilized human being. And the whole community expects that of you. And once you'd learned to do that in post-World War II Middle America, you then got sent off to college if you had the capacity to do that, to become an Orange World. And the local leaders were a combination of blue and orange. very entrepreneurial, farmers. In fact, I'll tell a story about an old farmer from that era who just recently automated his calf raising to be totally computerized, totally automated. That's the mentality of my parents' generation, right? And he goes to church and is a deacon at the church, right? And he would never leave that behind, right? So it was multi-mimetic all the way. And so I think Graves grew up in a similar society where churches and schools expected to instill the rules of civilization into their students, right? And then you went off to college and you learned that there was a bigger world out there, and colleges taught orange thinking. Not always very successfully. And I think, David, it was you maybe that mentioned going to college and discovering that it had been invaded by green goo, right? Postmodern trap.
Well, I think it was my first true exposure to that, like in a high complexity way.
Yeah, and at first, when I was first exposed to this, I thought of it as green. It turns out I now think that it's a red-blue ism that comes from green people just mistakenly throwing out ideas that out of context, right? So I will never forget as a college student having a bunch of folks coming running back into the dorm going, "Oh, we just bombed Professor so-and-so's house. The old geezer takes money from the army." This is Vietnam, right? And so we just bombed his house to show him what it's like to be napalmed. And I knew the guy, and I said, "Well, but doesn't he have small children?" And there was, "So what?" And so we have this, this is not a green way of thinking. I don't care how toxic your green is. You're not going to burn kids to prove that that war is bad, right? That's not healthy green thinking.
I don't know how many of you have read the Listening Society, but there was a really helpful chapter in that book where they talk about making the distinction between complexity and code.
Yep.
And how the code is the content and the ideas. Complexity is the level of understanding that goes with that. And so you can have a situation like what you're talking about, Barbara, which in the book they call it downshifting, which is someone's grabbing onto a higher code, but using it at a lower level of complexity.
Yes. And
so
it's dangerous. It is so dangerous, right?
It can be if there's not the overlying stronger complexity to keep it in check.
Exactly. So, it loses context, right?
Well, one of the examples they use is Frank Sinatra as being downshifted orange. So Frank Sinatra sings about, "I did it my way," like this very individualistic, but you take away the blue and orange overlying society, and that could be very red, right? Like doing it my way, the power thing. And Frank Sinatra himself is not a scientist or a capitalist or functioning at a high orange level, but he's singing the values. And so because there's the overlying structure of society, the orange values can be expressed at lower levels of complexity, but not cause harm. Some people would say Trump was even that. Trump was spewing off all kinds of blue and orange stuff, but didn't seem to really have any internal understanding of like these platitudes he was making to blue and orange. He was still like very much a be loyal to me, power, very impulsive red kind of structure there. But because there was this blue-orange system to contain him, he never was able to express like a full-on hard red in any way. And in a lot of ways, I was just like looking at his personal history and being born into wealth and in a family where he was kind of privileged. He maybe got kind of stuck at red, but learned through his life to adapt himself to blue-orange society and tell all these blue-orange people what they wanted to hear. And, you know, if you think about it, like people always slam Trump for not being smart, but like, boy, to do that is being an extremely intelligent person from where he's at.
Yeah, I think you're right. This research that Garvey Berger has about so much blue in American corporate life, right? And so they sound as if they're orange, right? They sound as if they're capitalists, but they have no concept of what that means. That they're simply singing from the hymn book.
So yeah, I think in the same sense, like, you know, we have to be careful with, you know, yellow can downshift too. And
It's got to have a dark side too. It just does. In fact, maybe we've seen one. I don't know if you guys saw this little piece in the news. Mexico kicked a wealthy entrepreneur out of the country because there's the physics that putting sulfur into the upper atmosphere can do like volcanoes do and kind of have a winter yeah. So he's decided that all the corporate crap that folks like Biden are doing of giving all their friends this incredible amount of money to do green energy that won't do a thing in the overall scheme of things has to be stopped. So he started just launching balloons from his place in Mexico into the stratosphere filled with sulfur, right? Now I can see that being a yellow reaction to, you know, if yellow is really about survival, I can't fix these broken lower memes, so I'm just going to solve the problem myself, right?
yeah, when you told your story, Eric, it reminded me of when I first was learning about spiral dynamics, and I was telling people about it, like, oh, this is such a great theory. And my sister-in-law is a tenured anthropology professor. And I was telling her about, like, oh, it's so great. And I got a reaction kind of similar to yours, where she was like, well, all of the old psychology studies are invalid because they were all performed largely on young white men. And she like just completely negated the whole thing. And I was like, I'm like, well, that's not an entirely untrue criticism. But there has been like developmental studies done in a more on more diverse populations that have shown similar trajectory.
And Graves is not men. It had equal amounts of women. So it's simply that it was white Americans who may or may not be anything like representative of the normal universe. Josh, you had a thought.
Yeah, on that topic and on the slide that's up. So there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Jared Diamond, people are familiar with that. He's written other stuff. Now he's you know, he's gotten criticism, obviously, and no one's 100% right. He's a bit postmodern, I would say, but I think he's done the best version of debunking racism, even though it's funny, postmodern people also don't like him because he also uses science, and that's not a huge fan. People aren't a fan of that always, but he points out that a lot of the reason why certain parts of the world developed quicker than others is because, well, guns, germs, and steel, but it actually went a lot deeper than that. It went based on like what protein crops were available, what animals that were able to be domesticated. So you could domesticate sheep things, you can domesticate cow things, pig things. You can't domesticate hippo things or rhinoceros things. And if Africans had learned to domesticate and ride rhinoceroses, I mean, we'd probably be living in an African colony. But so all that stuff, and then there could even be the argument of, well, if you are living, the new stages come about when there's a problem. And if you are living at subsistence as most tribal people were, you don't need to go do more. You're in stasis, so you're good. And it could be argued that the people who ended up going north and then switching all that and then developing more advanced civilizations, those were actually the outcasts, right? Those are the ones who weren't like get the fuck out, like, because who else would leave the area there? They were forced out. There's almost no animals that are like, yeah, my habitat's sweet, but I'll find it. It's like, no, they take it over unless they're pushed out by others. So whatever, but I think there's inherently actually a lot of the postmodernist view, I actually think is racist. Like, and I don't mean racist against white males, that's true, but like, I mean racist against the groups that they're trying to protect, because they think that there's like totally different brain stuff, so you can go into the noble savage kind of stuff too, which is definitely racist. The idea, the pure Native Americans with like birds on their shoulders. And it's like, they had slaves and they were in constant tribal warfare. That being said, I do think that they were a lot closer to balance with the natural world. And yeah, so that's definitely all true. But anyway, the idea that only the white people, and then also, Middle Eastern people, and also, actually be, Mexican, South American people and Asian people, only they developed this further civilization because there's just like something uniquely different and off and almost, in a sense, evil. I believe that had those other areas, like if you plop a biologically Native American, a biologically African person into those societies, they would have developed the same cultural stuff. And I think if you gave, say, Native Americans long enough, they would have probably developed the same things that the Europeans did. Maybe the boats would look different, whatever. It would be pretty damn similar. And then they would go over and conquer Europe if Europe hadn't advanced as far. So that's my whole take on the thing. I think this idea of like, this group is better than, in order to protect, I think actually comes from that root of thinking, they would, the idea of like, the pure good people here would never develop to the point where they're doing this stuff. And like, that's almost like pushing them down into this like childlike thing. So that's my take. And so when I hear people just out of hand dismiss spiral dynamics as that, I just like, I don't think they really have much of an argument.
No, and we do have to remember that some of the cultural studies about war, say in New Guinea primitive societies, suggest that Westerners haven't even come close to the ability to undertake genocide against their neighbors.
Well, we certainly have more systematic ways of killing more people. I mean, like obviously the Nazis had, they were able to kill a lot more people than just going with a spear to your neighboring tribe.
Yeah, but if you look at Rwanda, spears and rocks were just fine.
Yeah, you can kill a lot of people that way, that's for sure.
Right. David?
Oh. Yeah, I think you brought up some good points there too. And I think one of the kind of the warnings that like that postmodernism is only just kind of like sensing green as much as it's being green, and like why it's so off-putting in a lot of
Whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I think a lot of ways, and like kind of thinking back to the example of Martin Luther holding blue accountable as to itself. I think part of what needs to happen is like to hold green accountable to itself so that it can like actually do what it's supposed to do to respond to orange, because it's failing at that right now. But to be fair, like the negative green reactions to spiral dynamics, It happened to me another way too. I have a friend who's a very much orange, like investment banker, has got his investment firm and everything. I was all excited, told him about spiral dynamics, and he's like, stage theory, that sounds Marxist.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Really?
Definitely not.
That
Marxist.
sounds like a postmodernist distortion, right?
Yeah, it's not, I mean, because Marxist would be oppressor versus oppressed, right? So that's, but yeah. Well, anyone who doesn't, I mean, that's the problem with the spiral dynamics model. If you don't have access to any element of integral thinking, you will automatically out of hand reject it because you're not in the in crowd anymore there. So there is an issue with that. And I do try to, I'm trying more and more not use the terminology, and certainly don't, even though it is a hierarchy, sorry, tough shit, like, or sorry, holarchy, I just don't talk about that part. I'm just like, oh, it's just on a line and whatever. They're just different values through which we, lenses through which we view the world. Modern, most people don't have a problem if you call them traditional. It's like, yeah, right. I'm traditional. And it's like, you're modern. Thank you. I know I'm modern. You're postmodern. And most of them are like, yeah. So those are all safe things to point people out, and they'll rarely reject that. But whatever, you can't really call somebody red in pleasant language. You're just egocentric.
Yeah,
okay.
no, the best you can do is call it for what it is, adolescence, right? Despite the fact that they're 50 years old and still stuck there.
Well, I don't think it's the best you can do, because I don't think they're going to respond well to that. So it depends if you're talking to them or talking about them.
Yeah, I don't know what actually Don's verbiage that he used for teenagers was do you want to be the class bully, or do you want to be the defender of your people? And so if we thought of red as having the potential for being a defender of all of those who needed defense,
Yes.
that we might well work with them better, right?
Yeah, that's, I would say, effective way to do that. But I wanted to just touch on real quick, I got to go in a minute, but what David said about holding green accountable. So folks know, folks who know me, I don't know how well you know me, but I've probably worked on more in like professional and volunteer organizing, actual organizing capacity, not just like griping on online, on green postmodern causes than pretty much any 99 out of 100 people that I know. Like, and yet at the same time, perhaps it's my egocentrism or my demeanor, because I don't know how to keep my mouth shut, but I am also more attacked by those folks. Basically, anytime I say anything I kind of believe. So your comment, David, about the holding green accountable. So how do you propose that to be done, David?
Well, that's the great question, right? I don't necessarily have an answer for how to do that. I think it starts with holding green accountable in ourselves. And I think then the next thing is working locally, because the macro system just seems so broken.
Right.
And how to do that, how to start local projects where it's not just parroting green code, but creating green systems that accomplish green goals.
Without hurting the indigenous vMemes, some of which will be white male.
Right, it's a hard thing. Well, that's what I'm struggling with. And what I've been trying to do is I've been creating new entities, because it can't work with the existing ones, it's clear. And, I don't know if this is like fake turquoise or what, but it's like, I try to have the green elements there. So we're going to promote diversity, but guess what? We're not actually going to exclude the other people, but I don't say it explicitly, and I'm probably not the best person to really be leading these things. And I actually create these collectives where I'm just one of many, even though I'm secretly pulling all the strings because I end up doing most of the work. Like I'm happy to have other people do more, but I do have other folks involved, and it's like, we have a thing where we don't have a diversity statement. We have diversity actions, like we actually do a thing where I do try to promote more women, but we don't have a thing where we're like, oh, in September, only women can submit to our anthology. Like, I won't allow that level of idiocy. So that's my hope. But the other thing is, I notice if you talk to people one-on-one in person who you can actually find some reasonable levels. Like, there was somebody who was very, very green, super, super, super green stuff. And I remember she actually had a friend, and it helped that one of them, I think, was interested in dating me. So I didn't manipulate that, but I think that gave me some cachet. But she was very like militant green across the board. And I can't remember the topic, but I think it was something to do with well, maybe sometimes men also have problems, and I was able to kind of broach some like delicate stuff, after clearly affirming my, credentials. Her friend, who's completely green, also accepted me. It took all of these I don't even use it. It's not machination. It took all of this, I had to be check marked many times to finally be like, well, sometimes men have problems. And she's like, so that's so much work for so little gain.
But that's the back to our original topic, not of the Western lens, but of, can we see our own life conditions, right? So the more complex your brain is, the more likely you are to look out and see folks whose actions aren't congruent with the conditions that they're living in, right? But that doesn't mean that they're at a stage where they can see that door in the wall that's just wide open to you, right? So I think that's part of the quest to help people at whatever stage they're at to be more accurate about what their true life conditions are and less mystical. Eric, you had a thought.
Yeah, Barbara, just maybe to wrap up the point, because I also need to hop off here. Josh, I think you would have seen this in the presentation that I gave to the STI group. In chat, I'm going to put a link to a book that was written by Kenneth Pike. And Kenneth has really explored this idea of an etic and emic distinction of interpretation. What does it mean to have an outsider's point of view of something? And what does it mean to have an insider view of that? And the level of depth that he goes into, I think, really brings out a nuance that gets to the question, Barbara, that was being asked, which is, are these stage theories that are being constructed externally to particular groups bringing out a that's there that applies to all groups? Or is it just more of a certain construct, even if it's reinforced multiple times over multiple generations and even, continually developed and developed and developed? Is that really just something that may be a distinct path for whatever participates in that group, but an outside entity could take something and truly transform the whole way that the model would be seen? So for example, say we identify a group over here that would be at blue, but we explored in such a way that we would embed ourselves within that community that it no longer appears blue. You actually see a fuller range of the spiral at play. So Kenneth's investigation into this idea, I think, really brings out some interesting nuances worth folks checking out, just in terms of how he describes what can only be seen from an outsider point of view. So like with a lot of indigenous communities, we're very capitalistically oriented, scientifically oriented, STEM, all that stuff. But these groups are still, and I'm not talking like the ones who are capital prone in indigenous communities, there are those folks too. But I'm saying those who uphold traditional ways, even though the rest of the world around them is heavily capitalized in a global economy. And what is it about their thinking that may reveal things about the stars, that may reveal things about themselves, maybe their own internal hierarchies? But we wouldn't be able to look at that to use that as a demonstration that maybe all these other models that are external are still missing the mark, because this one particular group shows that stage theory is actually just trying to label a group, not recognizing that whatever construct was built over here may be off the mark in terms of what this entity could represent. But we wouldn't know that unless we were inside of that entity. So it's almost like we're assuming we know all things, but how does that get into actually applying it?
So we're at the top of the hour, and that is a really good question to leave with, I think, because it goes to the heart of the original question. Are we still not seeing the water that we're swimming in? And I think probably both and is what I'd end with. There's both some internal consistency and also some not yet able to step into another person's shoes that we still continue to need to deal with.